Sometimes the most important person you meet on the worst day of your life looks like someone the world has already forgotten. The late afternoon sun hung low over Highway 17, casting long golden lines across the cracked asphalt as cars rushed past at 70 miles an hour, most drivers too busy to notice the woman standing beside a silent black Bentley with its hood open. Charlotte Hayes checked her phone again, frustration tightening her jaw. No signal, no driver, no assistant. Just miles of empty California road, and the faint smell of overheated metal drifting from the engine. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions felt strangely small beside a broken machine she couldn't fix. A pickup truck from another decade rolled slowly to a stop behind her car, its faded blue paint dulled by years of sun and work. The engine clicked off, and a man stepped out wearing worn jeans and a mechanic's shirt smudged with grease. He moved with calm patience, the kind that didn't belong to someone in a hurry. "Looks like your engine overheated," he said gently, glancing toward the open hood. Charlotte studied him with guarded skepticism. She had built an empire by trusting instincts, and her instinct told her this stranger looked like every small-town mechanic she had ever passed without noticing. "I already called for assistance," she replied, cool and distant. "Thank you." The man nodded as if her tone didn't matter. "Of course, ma'am. Just thought I'd offer. Heat like this can cook an engine in minutes." Inside the pickup, a small voice spoke from the passenger seat. "Daddy, are we still going to be late for the school recital?" The man smiled toward the truck before answering softly. "We've got a few minutes, Lucy." Charlotte glanced past him and saw a young girl with bright, curious eyes holding a worn sketchbook on her lap. Something about the scene felt unexpectedly gentle. The man stepped closer to the Bentley, carefully studying the engine without touching anything yet. "If it's the coolant line, I might be able to get you moving again," he said. Charlotte folded her arms. "You're a roadside mechanic now?" The man chuckled quietly. "No, ma'am. Just someone who's fixed a lot of engines in his life." He reached forward and adjusted a loose connector with practiced precision. As he did, the sunlight caught something on his hand. A ring. Not gold. Not decorative. A heavy silver ring engraved with a crest Charlotte recognized instantly. Her breath caught before she could stop it. She had seen that crest before, framed on the wall of her father's office when she was a child, a symbol worn only by a very small group of officers who had graduated from one of the most demanding military academies in the country. Charlotte's expression shifted, curiosity replacing irritation as she stared at the ring again. The quiet mechanic didn't notice her reaction. He simply tightened one last clamp and wiped his hands on a rag before stepping back. "Try starting it now," he said calmly. Charlotte turned the key. The Bentley's engine roared back to life smoothly, as if the breakdown had never happened at all. But Charlotte Hayes wasn't looking at the dashboard anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on the ring on the stranger's hand, and for the first time since her car had stopped on that lonely stretch of highway, she realized the man standing in front of her might not be who he appeared to be at all. Charlotte Hayes did not immediately step out of the car after the engine started. Instead, she sat there for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel while the quiet hum of the Bentley filled the warm California air. The mechanic had already stepped back toward his old pickup truck as if the job had ended the moment the engine came back to life. That alone surprised her. Most people she met either asked for money, recognition, or a business card. This man simply fixed the problem and walked away. Charlotte finally opened the door and stepped out, her heels touching the pavement with careful precision. The heat rising from the highway shimmered in thin waves, carrying the faint smell of motor oil and summer dust. The man was already closing his toolbox when she spoke. "Wait." Her voice carried more curiosity than authority now. He turned calmly, his expression patient, the same quiet steadiness still in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte gestured toward the engine. "You fixed it in less than 5 minutes." The man shrugged lightly. "Loose coolant connector. Happens more often than people think." Lucy leaned slightly out of the pickup window, watching the conversation with open interest. Charlotte crossed her arms, studying him more carefully now. His shirt was worn but clean, his posture straight without trying to appear impressive. And then there was the ring again. Sunlight struck the engraved crest, the metal catching the light for only a second before his hand moved. "What is your name?" she asked. The man wiped his hands with a folded cloth before answering. Daniel Brooks. Charlotte repeated the name quietly, as if testing how it sounded. Daniel Brooks did not look like someone who once stood in a room with admirals and commanders, yet the ring said otherwise. Lucy suddenly leaned farther out the window. "Daddy, can we go now? The recital starts in 40 minutes. Daniel smiled back at her. "We are leaving in just a second." Charlotte glanced at the girl again. The child's sketchbook rested against the door frame, covered with bright crayon drawings of houses, trees, and what looked like a large smiling sun. Something about that simple scene felt strangely grounding compared to the glass towers and conference rooms Charlotte normally lived inside. She turned back to Daniel. "You helped without asking anything in return." Daniel looked genuinely confused by the observation. "Your car needed help." Charlotte let out a quiet breath. "Most people who recognize me would have asked for a lot more than that." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Should I recognize you?" The question was not sarcastic. It was sincere. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte Hayes realized someone standing in front of her had absolutely no idea who she was. She studied his face carefully, searching for even the smallest sign of recognition. There was none, only calm politeness and a quiet readiness to leave. Charlotte felt something shift inside her, something she had not felt in years. Curiosity. "No," she said slowly. "You should not." Daniel nodded once, satisfied with the answer, and turned back toward the truck. As he opened the driver's door, Charlotte's eyes dropped once more to the silver ring on his hand. The engraved crest was unmistakable. Her father used to say only the most disciplined officers earned the right to wear that symbol. Yet here stood Daniel Brooks, a man driving a 20-year-old pickup truck, raising a little girl, and fixing engines on the side of the highway like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Charlotte Hayes suddenly realized the most interesting part of this encounter had nothing to do with the broken car. It had everything to do with the quiet man who had just fixed it. Daniel Brooks settled into the driver's seat of the pickup truck and turned the key, the old engine rumbling with a familiar steady rhythm that sounded very different from the polished hum of the Bentley behind him. Lucy adjusted the seatbelt across her small shoulder and looked toward the rear window. "Daddy, the lady is still watching us." Daniel glanced briefly into the side mirror and saw Charlotte Hayes standing beside her car, arms folded lightly as she observed them both with thoughtful curiosity. He did not seem surprised by the attention. Instead, he shifted the truck into gear slowly, preparing to merge back onto the highway. But before the pickup could move more than a few feet, Charlotte raised her hand again. Daniel paused and lowered the window. Warm air flowed through the cab, carrying the distant sound of traffic rushing past at 70 miles per hour. Charlotte walked closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement until she stood beside the driver door. Lucy studied her with the unfiltered honesty only children possess. "Your car is very shiny," Lucy said. Charlotte smiled faintly at the comment. "Thank you. Your father seems to know exactly how to keep cars running." Lucy nodded proudly. "He fixes everything." Daniel cleared his throat gently. "We should get moving. The recital does not wait for late arrivals." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "Your daughter has a recital tonight?" Lucy leaned forward eagerly. "Yes. I am singing a song with my class. Daddy promised he would be there." Daniel gave Lucy a reassuring glance before looking back at Charlotte. "It is about 20 minutes away if traffic behaves." Charlotte nodded slowly, as if considering something. The highway wind tugged lightly at her hair, while the late afternoon sun reflected across the polished surface of the Bentley. For a moment, she seemed less like a powerful executive and more like someone searching for the right words. "You helped me today without hesitation," she said quietly. Daniel shrugged again with the same calm humility. "Anyone would have done the same." Charlotte raised one eyebrow gently. "No, not everyone." Lucy suddenly leaned toward Daniel and whispered loudly enough for Charlotte to hear. "Daddy, I think I know who she is." Daniel blinked once in confusion. "Who?" Lucy pointed excitedly toward Charlotte with the careful innocence of a child who had just solved a puzzle. "She is the lady from the television. The one with the big electric car company." Charlotte laughed softly before Daniel could respond. It was not a loud laugh, just a quiet acknowledgement that the secret had finally surfaced. Daniel turned back toward her slowly. "Electric car company?" Charlotte extended her hand politely. "Charlotte Hayes." Daniel looked at her hand, then at Lucy, then back at Charlotte. Recognition flickered faintly across his face, though it carried none of the awe or excitement she was used to seeing. Instead, there was only calm understanding. "I see." Lucy gasped softly. "Daddy, she is famous." Daniel shook Charlotte's hand once, firm but brief. "Nice to meet you, Miss Hayes." Charlotte studied him carefully again, noticing how little the revelation seemed to affect him. Most people reacted to her name with excitement, questions, or ambition. Daniel Brooks simply acknowledged it and returned his attention to the road ahead. The silence lasted only a second, but in that moment Charlotte Hayes realized something unusual. The quiet mechanic with the silver ring was still the most interesting person standing on that highway, and the fact that he was not impressed by her name made her want to understand him even more. Daniel Brooks gave Charlotte Hayes a polite nod, then shifted his attention back to the road ahead as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "Lucy and I really should get going," he said calmly. "Second-grade recitals do not wait for traffic delays." Lucy giggled quietly at that and hugged her sketchbook closer to her chest. Charlotte watched the two of them for a moment, her mind unexpectedly busy. People usually reacted to her name in predictable ways. They asked for photographs, investments, job opportunities, or introductions. Daniel Brooks had simply acknowledged who she was and prepared to drive away. The calm simplicity of that response felt strangely refreshing. "1 second," Charlotte said. Daniel paused with his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. Charlotte glanced down again at the silver ring on his finger. The engraved crest caught the light once more, the same unmistakable symbol she had recognized earlier. "That ring," she said carefully. Daniel followed her gaze briefly and then looked back, up with the faintest hint of a smile. "Old habit," he replied. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "That is not just any ring." Lucy looked between them with curiosity. "Daddy got that a long time ago," she explained proudly. Daniel gave his daughter a gentle look that said she did not need to reveal every detail of his life to strangers on the side of a highway. Charlotte studied his expression carefully. "My father used to talk about that academy when I was a little girl," she said. "He always said the officers who graduated from there were among the most disciplined people in the country." Daniel seemed thoughtful for a moment before answering. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Charlotte raised one eyebrow. "You are avoiding the question." Daniel let out a quiet breath, not annoyed, just accepting that the conversation had taken a turn he could not easily step away from. "Yes," he said simply. "I spent some time there." Lucy leaned forward eagerly. "Daddy used to work on really big ships." Daniel chuckled softly. "Lucy." Charlotte's curiosity deepened. The pieces did not seem to fit together. A man who once wore that ring did not usually end up driving a 20-year-old pickup truck and fixing engines on the side of the highway. "You left?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "A long time ago." Charlotte folded her arms lightly, studying him in the warm evening sunlight. The wind from passing traffic brushed gently through the roadside grass, while the sky slowly shifted toward the deeper orange colors of sunset. "Most people who earn that ring do not walk away from that kind of career," she said. Daniel looked out toward the road for a moment before answering. His voice remained steady, but there was a quiet honesty in it. "Life changes priorities." Lucy smiled and squeezed his arm. "Daddy says the most important job he has now is being my dad." Charlotte felt something inside her chest soften slightly at those words. She had spent years surrounded by people chasing power and success, yet this quiet man seemed completely comfortable choosing something simpler. Daniel turned the key slightly, as if preparing to pull back onto the highway. "Miss Hayes, it was nice meeting you," he said. "But I promised my daughter I would be in the audience tonight." Charlotte nodded slowly, watching him with new respect. "You keep your promises." Daniel glanced toward Lucy with a warm smile. "I try to." As the pickup truck finally began rolling forward, Charlotte remained standing beside her Bentley, the sound of Daniel's old engine fading gradually into the evening traffic. She looked down at the empty stretch of highway and then at the place where the truck had disappeared around the bend. For the first time in a very long while, Charlotte Hayes found herself thinking less about the business meeting she had been rushing to attend and more about the quiet man with the silver ring who believed that being a father was the most important job in the world. The old pickup truck rolled steadily along the two-lane road that led toward Pine Valley Elementary School, the late afternoon sun glowing softly across the windshield, while Lucy hummed quietly in the passenger seat. Daniel Brooks drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting loosely near the gearshift, his calm focused completely on the road ahead. The highway encounter already felt like a strange interruption in an otherwise ordinary day. Lucy glanced sideways at him with bright curiosity. "Daddy, she really was that Charlotte Hayes?" Daniel nodded once. "That is what she said." Lucy leaned forward excitedly. "Her company makes those electric cars that everyone talks about. Mrs. Campbell at school says they are the future." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe they are." Lucy tilted her head. "You were not surprised." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Famous people still have engines that break down." Lucy laughed softly at that answer. The pickup truck turned off the main highway onto a quieter road lined with tall oak trees and small houses with front porches and white fences. Pine Valley was the kind of town where people waved when they passed each other and where Friday night football games still filled the high school stadium with families carrying blankets and hot chocolate. Daniel had chosen this place very carefully years ago because it felt quiet and safe, a place where Lucy could grow up without the noise of the world chasing them. Meanwhile, several miles away, Charlotte Hayes finally stepped back into her Bentley and closed the door slowly. The engine purred beneath the polished hood, but her mind remained on the man who had already disappeared down the highway. She rested her hands lightly on the steering wheel, but did not drive yet. Instead, she stared at the road ahead, replaying the conversation again and again in her mind. A man who had clearly graduated from one of the most demanding military academies in the country was now living quietly in a small town, raising a daughter and repairing engines for strangers. The story did not make sense. Charlotte reached toward the passenger seat where her phone rested and tapped the screen thoughtfully. Within seconds, the familiar voice of her assistant answered. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes." Charlotte spoke calmly. "Emily, I need you to look into someone for me." "Of course." Charlotte paused briefly before continuing. "His name is Daniel Brooks. Former military academy graduate. Possibly naval engineering background." There was a short silence on the line as Emily typed. "Do you have a location?" Charlotte glanced toward the highway sign she had passed earlier. "Somewhere near Pine Valley, California." Emily responded immediately. "I will start searching." Charlotte looked out through the windshield as a light breeze moved the roadside grass. She remembered the way Daniel had spoken about his daughter, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said being a father was his most important job. It was the kind of conviction she rarely heard in the boardrooms where everyone measured life by profit charts and market predictions. Emily spoke again through the phone. "Miss Hayes, this may take a little time. There are many Daniel Brooks records." Charlotte nodded slightly. "That is fine. I am not in a hurry." She ended the call and finally placed the Bentley into drive, the luxury car gliding smoothly onto the road. But as Charlotte Hayes drove toward the city skyline in the distance, one thought remained clear in her mind. Somewhere in a quiet town ahead of her, a man with a Silver Academy ring had chosen a simple life over prestige, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she felt compelled to understand why. The small auditorium at Pine Valley Elementary glowed with warm yellow lights as families filled the rows of folding chairs, their quiet conversations blending with the sound of children practicing songs behind the curtain. Daniel Brooks sat in the third row with his hands folded loosely in his lap, his eyes resting on the stage while Lucy stood with her classmates behind the blue curtain preparing for the recital. The air smelled faintly of polished wood floors and paper decorations taped along the walls. It was not a grand place, but it felt alive with something far more valuable than elegance. It felt like home. Daniel watched as teachers gently organized the children into lines, their small voices whispering excitedly, while parents lifted phones and cameras in anticipation. A quiet sense of peace settled over him, the kind that came from simple promises kept. Meanwhile, several miles away, the glass walls of Hayes Mobility headquarters reflected the deep orange colors of sunset across downtown San Francisco. Charlotte Hayes stepped out of the elevator and walked into her private office overlooking the city skyline. The office was large, modern, and silent except for the distant hum of traffic 40 floors below. She set her keys on the desk and loosened the collar of her jacket slightly before sitting down in the leather chair. Within moments, her phone vibrated. Emily's voice came through clearly. "Miss Hayes, I believe I found the record you asked for." Charlotte leaned forward slightly. "Tell me." Papers shuffled on the other end of the call. Daniel Brooks graduated from the United States Naval Academy 15 years ago. Engineering program. Top 10% of his class. Charlotte felt her earlier suspicions settle into confirmation. And after graduation, Emily continued reading. He served as a naval systems engineer for several years working on advanced propulsion technology. His supervisors described him as exceptionally disciplined and highly respected. Charlotte looked out across the skyline as the city lights slowly began to flicker on one by one. Then why is he fixing cars on the side of a highway? Emily paused before answering. It appears he resigned his commission nearly 9 years ago. Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly. Resign? Yes, Emily said. The file indicates a personal request for separation after a family emergency. Charlotte felt a quiet tension form in her chest. What kind of emergency? Emily's voice softened. His wife passed away unexpectedly. He had a daughter who was only a few months old at the time. Charlotte remained silent for several seconds, absorbing the weight of that information. The image of Daniel standing beside his pickup truck returned clearly in her mind, the calm steadiness in his voice when he spoke about Lucy. Emily continued gently. After leaving the Navy, he relocated to Pine Valley and has worked locally ever since. It appears he never returned to any engineering field despite his qualifications. Charlotte finally spoke again. So he gave up everything. Emily responded quietly. It seems he chose to raise his daughter himself. Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the darkening sky beyond the glass windows. The city below her pulsed with ambition and competition, a world where success was measured by speed and growth. Yet somewhere in a quiet town outside the city, a man with one of the strongest technical minds the Navy had trained had chosen a different path entirely. He had chosen to be present for his child instead of chasing recognition. Charlotte Hayes closed her eyes briefly as the truth settled in her thoughts. For the first time that day, the story finally made sense. Daniel Brooks had not lost his purpose. He had simply chosen the one that mattered most to him. The applause inside Pine Valley Elementary School rose warmly through the small auditorium as the final group of children finished their song. Daniel Brooks stood from his seat along with the other parents, clapping with quiet pride while Lucy and her classmates bowed awkwardly under the bright stage lights. Lucy searched the audience until she spotted him and waved enthusiastically, her smile wide and joyful. Daniel raised his hand and waved back, his calm expression softening in a way that rarely appeared outside moments like this. For him, the evening had been simple but meaningful, a promise kept and a memory made. After the recital ended, the hallway quickly filled with excited voices, parents congratulating their children while teachers guided everyone toward the exit. Lucy ran toward Daniel the moment she stepped off the stage, nearly bouncing with excitement. "Daddy, did you hear my part?" she asked breathlessly. Daniel knelt slightly to her height and smiled. "I heard every word." Lucy hugged him tightly. "I was nervous at first, but then I saw you in the front row." Daniel rested his hand gently on her shoulder. "That is why I sit where you can see me." Lucy grinned proudly before pulling back to show him the small ribbon her teacher had handed out after the performance. "Miss Parker says we all did amazing." Daniel examined the ribbon like it was a medal from an Olympic competition. "Then Miss Parker must be correct." Lucy laughed and skipped toward the door, while Daniel followed a few steps behind, the quiet satisfaction of the evening settling comfortably in his chest. Meanwhile, across the city, Charlotte Hayes remained seated in her office long after the rest of the building had begun to empty. The skyline outside her window glittered with thousands of lights, each one representing another person chasing a goal or a deadline in the restless city below. Yet Charlotte found herself thinking not about quarterly reports or production forecasts, but about a small school auditorium miles away where a man had chosen to spend his evening applauding his daughter's song. Emily's earlier report remained open on the tablet in front of her, Daniel Brooks's record displayed across the screen. Top engineering graduate, naval propulsion specialist, a career path that should have led to prestigious research facilities and defense contracts. Instead, it had led to a quiet mechanic shop in Pine Valley and a second-grade recital. Charlotte leaned back slowly in her chair, folding her arms as she studied the information again. The more she thought about it, the more unusual the story became. In her world, people rarely walked away from opportunity, especially not someone with a mind trained at that level. Yet Daniel Brooks had not just stepped away from prestige. He had stepped away without regret. That realization stayed with her as she stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city streets far below. Cars streamed through the glowing grid of downtown traffic, while the distant hum of life carried upward through the glass. Charlotte spoke quietly to herself, almost like a thought becoming a decision. A mind like that should not be hidden in a small garage. She turned back toward her desk and picked up the phone again. Emily answered immediately. "Yes, Miss Hayes." Charlotte's voice remained calm but purposeful. "Tomorrow morning, I want a full proposal prepared for a new engineering lead." Emily paused slightly. "For the propulsion development team?" Charlotte nodded, even though Emily could not see her. "Yes, and schedule a visit to Pine Valley." There was a brief silence before Emily responded. "You are going there personally?" Charlotte looked once more toward the dark horizon beyond the city lights. "Some people are worth meeting twice." Morning sunlight spread gently across the quiet streets of Pine Valley as Daniel Brooks unlocked the door to the small auto repair garage where he worked. The building was simple, with faded white siding and a hand-painted sign that read Pine Valley Auto Service. Inside the shop, the familiar scent of motor oil and rubber tires hung in the cool air, while a radio on the shelf quietly played an old country song. Daniel set his toolbox down on the workbench and rolled up the sleeves of his work shirt, preparing for another ordinary day. Outside the garage, Lucy waited on the wooden bench near the office door with her backpack resting beside her. Daniel walked over and knelt slightly to straighten the strap on her shoulder. "School bus will be here in 5 minutes," he said calmly. Lucy nodded, but then looked toward the road with curiosity. "Daddy, do you think we will see the Bentley lady again?" Daniel smiled faintly. "The world is a big place." Lucy shrugged thoughtfully. "Miss Parker says sometimes important people come back when they meet someone interesting." Daniel laughed softly at that idea. "Then Miss Parker must read a lot of storybooks." A few minutes later, the yellow school bus appeared around the corner, and Lucy climbed aboard, waving enthusiastically through the window as it drove away. Daniel returned to the garage and began inspecting the engine of an old pickup truck that belonged to one of the local farmers. The morning passed peacefully with the quiet rhythm of tools turning bolts and engines humming back to life. Around 10:30, the calm routine was interrupted by the low purr of a luxury engine outside the garage. Daniel glanced toward the open door just as a sleek black Bentley rolled slowly to a stop beside the curb. He set the wrench down and wiped his hands with a cloth as Charlotte Hayes stepped out of the car. Unlike the rushed moment on the highway the day before, Charlotte looked relaxed and purposeful as she walked toward the garage entrance. Daniel greeted her with a polite nod. "Miss Hayes." Charlotte smiled slightly. "Good morning, Daniel." Daniel glanced toward the Bentley and then back at her. "Did the coolant connector fail again?" Charlotte laughed quietly. "No. This time the car is working perfectly." Daniel folded the cloth neatly and rested it on the workbench. "Then I assume you did not drive 40 miles just to check the engine." Charlotte stepped inside the garage and looked around the simple space filled with tools and half-repaired vehicles. The sunlight through the open door illuminated the Silver Academy ring on Daniel's hand again as he leaned against the workbench. Charlotte noticed it immediately. "I came because I believe you are working in the wrong place," she said calmly. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. "Most mechanics would disagree." Charlotte shook her head gently. "You are not just a mechanic. You are an engineer trained by one of the best institutions in the country." Daniel remained quiet for a moment. Charlotte continued speaking with thoughtful confidence. "I read your record last night." Daniel sighed softly, but did not appear surprised. "I suspected you might." Charlotte met his calm gaze. "Daniel Brooks. Hayes Mobility is building a new propulsion system that could change the electric vehicle industry. I want you to lead that project." The garage fell silent except for the ticking sound of a cooling engine nearby. Daniel looked toward the open doorway where sunlight spilled across the concrete floor. For a long moment, he said nothing, as if measuring the weight of the offer against the quiet life he had built in Pine Valley. Daniel Brooks remained leaning against the workbench as the quiet hum of the garage settled around them. Outside, the Bentley reflected the bright California morning, its polished surface almost glowing in the sunlight. Charlotte Hayes stood across from him with calm confidence, the kind that came from years of making decisions that shaped companies and industries. Yet this moment felt different even to her. She was not speaking to an executive or an investor. She was speaking to a man who had once chosen family over prestige. Daniel slowly exhaled and looked toward the open garage door where the road stretched through Pine Valley like a calm ribbon of gray. A pickup truck passed by, its driver lifting a friendly hand in greeting. Daniel returned the wave automatically before turning back to Charlotte. "That is a generous offer," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. "It is also a serious one. Your experience with propulsion engineering could change the direction of our entire research division." Daniel glanced down briefly at the Silver Academy ring on his hand, the metal catching the sunlight as he moved his fingers thoughtfully. Charlotte watched him carefully, understanding that his silence was not hesitation but consideration. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "The work you are describing would require long hours." Charlotte answered honestly. "Yes." Daniel continued. "Meetings in San Francisco." "Most likely." Daniel nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his mind. "Then there is one problem." Charlotte folded her arms slightly. "What problem?" Daniel's expression softened with quiet certainty. "My daughter." Charlotte remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Daniel looked toward the small desk in the corner of the garage where Lucy's crayon drawings were taped to the wall beside an old calendar. "Lucy is 8 years old," he said calmly. "Her school is 5 minutes from here. Her friends are here. Her life is here." Charlotte followed his gaze and saw the drawings for the first time. Bright colors filled the paper with simple houses, trees, and a smiling sun above them. It was the kind of picture that could only be drawn by a child who felt safe. Daniel turned back toward her. "I left the Navy because she needed someone who would be present." Charlotte listened carefully, not interrupting. Daniel continued in the same calm tone. "I will never make a decision that takes that away from her." For a moment the garage was completely silent except for the faint ticking sound of cooling metal from the truck engine nearby. Charlotte Hayes slowly nodded in understanding. "Then the job description needs to change." Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. Charlotte continued with a small smile. "Hayes Mobility has the resources to build research facilities anywhere, including Pine Valley." Daniel studied her expression, trying to determine whether she was serious. Charlotte stepped closer to the workbench. "You would lead the project from here. No relocation. No missed recitals." Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You would build an engineering lab in a town with one traffic light." Charlotte shrugged lightly. "Innovation does not require a big city. It requires the right mind." Daniel looked around the small garage again, then back at Charlotte. The offer now felt very different from the one she had first presented. Somewhere outside a breeze moved through the trees along the road, and the sound drifted softly through the open door. Daniel finally extended his hand. "If we do this," he said calmly, "we do it in a way that keeps my promise to Lucy." Charlotte shook his hand firmly. "That sounds like the kind of engineering decision I respect." And in that quiet moment inside a small Pine Valley garage, two very different worlds began to find a way to work together.